Hi everybody, welcome back to the Claremont Classic Garage. Today I seem to have a whole bunch of Ford Windsor engines in a million pieces all over my shop, so I thought before I put everything away, maybe we'll just kind of do a little bit of a Ford Windsor junkyard spotter's guide and kind of a few kind of really basic tips on how you can kind of not really soup them up, but maybe, spice them up a little bit with junkyard factory parts. Let's get started. A little disclaimer before we start. I am by no means an expert authority on these engines, but I can admit that I know enough about them to be dangerous. I just want to cover some really, really basic stuff about them, just in case there's fellas out there starting to mess around with cars. And they were probably born after the last Windsor engine was made. The last Windsor engine came out of the assembly line 24 years ago. So that's hard to believe for an old geezer like me, that these have been everywhere my entire life. Ford Windsor engines were like Tupperware. They were just everywhere. But anyway, that's disclaimer aside, let's get started. We refer to these as Windsor engines because they came from Ford's engine plant in Windsor, Ontario, Canada. And we are going to concentrate here on the carbureted ones. So that is 85 and older, or a little later in trucks. I think you could get a carburetor on a truck maybe till 87 or 88. But we're leaving the EFI engines out because I just want to talk about carburetor engines. Although there's some pretty good parts you can steal off some of them fuel-injected engines, if you know. But it's just a whole nother kettle of fish that I don't want to get involved with here. The Ford Windsor series of engines is just one of those great stories. It was produced, it was put in production vehicles from 1962 until 2001. That is incredible. That's a pretty good run. Now, over the years, from humble beginnings, they changed a lot, and they morphed and they grew, and they were adapted to fit the changing world and changing needs. So what we're going to do here is kind of a junkyard spotter's guide on these things. I'm by far no expert on them, but I've mucked around with them enough that maybe I can share some of my knowledge with you guys and save you some grief, at least, because you start mixing and matching stuff with these. You got to be careful because they made them for so long and there were so many changes. And this book is a must-have Bible for anybody that's going to mess with these engines. Tom Monroe's Small Block Ford book. This is just a great book. It's full of casting numbers, what fits what, how-tos, tips. Just a great book. If you're mucking around in a junkyard or at swamp meets, take this with you. All the casting numbers, all the part numbers are in here. It'll help you immensely to know what you're looking at. Just don't ever let me catch you pushing on a torque wrench like this guy is doing, or I'll smack you one upside the head. Ford wanted a small V8 engine that they could put in the Fairlane. And did they have Comets in 62? I guess they would have. Mercury would have had the Comet. I know I had a 63 Comet once, so maybe they had them in 62. But for sure the Fairlane. Anyway, the very first stab that Ford took at their small block engine was this here. This is a 1962 221 V8. In a previous video, we took this little guy apart because it was seized from sitting. So we took it apart and saw some of the stuff in it. So what we're going to do now is I want to show you the differences in some of these parts and some of the stuff that you could find in the junkyard. You don't have to spend a whole lot of money to have a whole lot of fun with these little engines, right? So this here is a 1985 302 that's all apart. And over there on the stand, we've got I think we determined that was a 1976 351 Windsor. So we've got from one from each decade, and we've got 2 low decks and 1 tall deck. These little guys had a tiny little 3.5-inch bore and a 2.870 stroke. Later in 62, or I guess around the same time, they revised the block to bore it 300 thou more and make the 260. So that was 3.8, but with the same 2.87 stroke. And then in 1964, they needed more. We always need more. They increased the stroke to 4 inches, but left the 2.87 crank in it and gave us the famous 289, which was in production from 64 through 1968. Starting in 1968, they left the bore at 4 inches, but increased the stroke with a new crankshaft to 3 inches and gave us the 302. Now, interesting, despite the thing constantly growing, in the 221, the 260, and the 289, the crankshaft and the rods are the same. The exception is the 289 hypo that used the different stuff. We're not going to get into that here. That's a whole different kettle of fish, and I'm not quite sure you'd find one of those in a wrecking yard. Other thing that is peculiar with these blocks is the back end of it. These blocks, the 221 and 260 for sure, maybe some 289s, use the 5-bolt bell housing. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Starting in 1965, they changed the spacing of the bolts a little bit and added another bolt on this side to give us the 6-bolt bell housing, which was used on many Ford 6 and 8 cylinder engines. This is the separator plate for the 5-bolt bell housing. So unless you have a 62 through 64 5-bolt bell housing transmission to bolt to this thing, you have to be very careful about using one of these. Now, thankfully, they're easy to tell. You just count the bolts. And if you're looking at just a bare block, you'll see here how the block is rounded around the bores like that. Like that. You'll only see that on the 221. If you see that, you know it's a 221. Plus, you could just grab a tape measure and you'll see these are only 3.5 inches. You can the difference between the 221 and the 260 is big enough that you can actually check it with a tape measure. If you get like 2 3/4 across here, you've got a 260. And of course, the easiest one is the 289 because it's 4 inches. But the 260 and the 289, you'll see this is straight across here. You can see what I mean on this 302 block. It's straight because as the bore got bigger, they needed this extra material in here for the water jacket. You can see these 221 heads. They mimic that shape of the block. We'll talk about heads in a little bit. Right now, I can't get off track. We're talking about cranks and blocks. So here's the crankshaft. Like I said, same crankshaft, 221, 260, 289. It is externally balanced and it uses a 28-ounce imbalance. Now this here, I'm pretty sure is unique to the 221. It's an undampened bob weight that goes on the front. You see there's no harmonic balancer. It's just a bob weight. All of these engines use the 28-ounce, the Ford 28-ounce imbalance. So you can see here, there's the 28-ounce bob weight on the, we'll call it a balancer for lack of a better word. And there's the weight that's on the flex plate. Also, these engines, 3-bolt crankshaft pulley, that would be used up to 1969 on the 302. Now we move to the 302, the famous 302. It's got the same 4-inch bore as the 289, but they increased the stroke to 3 inches. In around 1970, they switched to the 4-bolt configuration for the crankshaft pulley. You can get aftermarket vibration dampers that will have both bolt patterns in them, so you can use either style of pulley. This engine here being a 1985 engine, there's a couple of unique things about it. Starting in 1982, they switched the imbalance from 28 ounces to 50 ounces. And now you can see this crankshaft, the counterweights are a lot different looking than the counterweights on that 289 crank. They took a bunch of material out of the counterweights, so they had to add material to the imbalance. I guess that was an efficiency thing, right? So you could see here, that's the difference, right? Let's get the stuff from this and compare. So look at the difference. Here's the bob weights. Look at that. It goes 2/3 of the way around the pulley. These are the bob weights of a 50-ounce engine compared to the bob weights of a 28-ounce engine. That's why you got to be careful mixing and matching this stuff, right? You end up with an engine that'll shake like crazy and damage itself. You have to be careful. This 302 uses the much more common 6-bolt bell housing. You can see here they've added the extra bolt hole there. I'm going to superimpose the 2 bolt patterns together so we can see what's different. You can see the difference now between the 2 bolt patterns. What they did was they needed to make more room in the bell housing for bigger flex plates, bigger torque converters, and bigger flywheels. You can see here, this is the flex plate off the 221. Look at how much bigger the 302 flex plate is. They needed room for this stuff because as the engines kept getting bigger and making more power, they needed bigger clutches and bigger torque converters. And to solve the problem of putting a newer engine in an older car, you could go to a place like that sells race parts, Jag, Summit, any of those, and you can buy an aftermarket balancer that has both the 4-bolt and 3-bolt pulley patterns in it. So you could put this 1985 engine in your 66 Mustang and use your original pulleys and everything. And now, over the years, they did change a lot of stuff, right? You can see here in the block, you can see here there's a lot less metal. There's a lot less material around the bearing saddles, the main saddles on that 221 than there is in this 302. It's a lot beefier in these areas. A lot beefier. Now this is an E5 block, so this is a 1985 block. This is the first year, this is the first generation roller capable block. So this block, when it was coming down the line, it could have been assembled as a roller motor or as a flat tap motor. Flat tappet, pardon me. So in 85, the only thing that got rollerized valve train was the Mustang GT, 85 and 86. Starting in 87, they started putting them in all cars. So Crown Vics, Lincolns, Big Mercs, every Cougars and T-Birds, all the cars got roller cams starting in 1987. The trucks didn't get rollerized until 1992. So up until 1992, if you had a truck or a van engine, it would come just like this. Roller ready, but with a flat tappet cam in it. You can see they've got extended lifter bores. You can see how far the lifter goes down into that bore. See the extra little height on that lifter bore there. That's to accommodate the roller cam. If we look at this 260 block, when the tappets are down, they're flush with the top of the tappet bore. They're probably 1/8 of an inch down in that roller block. And then, like we say, More, more, more. We need more. It wasn't really that they needed more. It was that they had a hole to fill. Since the demise of the 352 in the FE series of engines, they didn't have any real kind of middle ground engine. It went right from a 302 to a 390. That was it in 1968. You went from a 302 to a 390. The trucks, I think the 360 truck engine, that's an FE engine, was out by then, but they never put those in cars, right? So Ford needed something to kind of fill that hole. So in 1969, this guy appeared. This is the 351 Windsor. So it stayed with the same 4-inch bore as the 289 and the 302, but they increased the stroke a half an inch from 3 inches to 3.5. Getting a little torque, you know. Nice long stroke, longer connecting rods. To do that, they had to increase the deck height of the block. So the 351 Windsor has got we call this a tall deck. It's more the size of a Chevy small block, this one. Whereas the 221 through 302 were such tiny little engines. It's basically an 1.25 inches taller deck height. That's pretty substantial. You can see here on this 302, we'll go through the middle of this frost plug here. The side of the block is, we're just, 4 5/8 tall. Whereas on this 351, it's 6 inches. Wow. Yeah, so that's a good size engine. So, in addition to making the deck taller, the cylinder heads ended up higher up and further apart, so they had to make a new intake manifold to go with it. And in 1971, they increased the deck height 23 thousandths of an inch to lower the compression just a smidge for emissions purposes. I don't know why they would have just put different pistons in it. Maybe they'd already ordered 14 million pistons and it was easier for them to make the deck height taller. Don't ask me, that's what they decided to do. Another thing that sets the 351 apart from the low deck versions is the size of the journals on the crankshaft. They increased it from 2.123 on the rod journals on the low deck engines to 2.311 on these guys. That's an 1/8 of an inch basically bigger. And the mains went from 2.25 to 3 inch. That's big. Here's the two beside each other. This is our low deck crankshaft on the right. And the difference in the pins is, or the throws, is not that evident. But look at the mains. Look at the difference in those. Now, that looks really impressive, right? You got a lot of beef there. What happens though is when guys, you're building a 351 for racing, you have to pay a lot more attention to keeping those big, huge mains oiled at high RPM. It takes a lot less oil to keep these little guys lubricated. So it's it's that give and take that you always get involved with when you're racing or modifying stuff. Give, take, right? Yes, this is a lot stronger, but you can't wind it out as much without, modifying. Whereas this little guy is a little more forgiving for high RPM, but it's not as strong. The low deck and the tall deck engines use very similar looking oil pans. You have to watch if you're looking for an oil pan and they're all laying on the ground at the swap meet. The 351 oil pan will give itself away because this here at the back, it's the half circle, whatever, the opening for where it goes over the rear cap. It's 5.5 inches, where it's only 5 inches on the low deck engines. And the back of the pan will be deeper here to allow for that big crankshaft to swing around. There are 3 basic types of oil pans you'll run across in these things. Aside from the difference between the 302 and the 351, you've got this one here. This is a front sump. You can see here, there's the oil pump. The pickup hangs right below it, down in there. And this is a front sump that fits passenger cars up to 1978 and a lot of 2-wheel drive trucks. Pickups, that is. Vans and some 4-wheel drive trucks will use this guy, the center sump. So you can see here the oil pump is there in the front corner like it always is, and then the pickup tube extends down, and it's got like it's kind of to the rear of center, but we call it a center sump. This here is the dual sump or rear sump oil pan, like you'll find on Fox body car or Crown Vic 79 and up. They'll all use this pan. It just has to have it. We call it a dual sump because it's got the extra low spot in the front to clear the oil pump. But the pickup comes back to here, and the oil is actually back in here. But it does have to have 2 drain plugs because it does capture a little bit of oil up in the front there. So that's your late model oil pan. If you're working on any of those type of cars, a Fox Mustang or a Crown Vic, you need one of these pans. And they do make, they call it a conversion pan. So you can use, there is a pan available for the 351 Windsor in this style. It's just a copy of the 79 and 80, I think. There was 351 Windsor Crown Vic police cars, and they would have used that oil pan. So Ford just kept making them. Mopar Performance. That's my Mopar showing. Ford Motorsport sold them as a they call it a 351 conversion pan or something. I can't remember, but they're around. Here's the pistons and rods all in a row. These are the 221 through 289. You can see here they're pretty much the same height compared to the 302. What they did when they made the 302 in 68, the difference in stroke was 130 thousandths of an inch. So half of that is 65 thousandths. So what they did was they made the connecting rod 65 thousandths of an inch shorter, and kept the top of the piston at the same spot in the bore. This here is the monster out of the 351. You can tell how much longer that is than the other two. That's the difference in the stroke. Interesting to note too that originally, I'm talking at the Ford dealer, not aftermarket stuff. 289 and 302 pistons were not compatible. If you put, even though the bore was the same, if you put a 289 piston on a 302 rod, it would hit the counterweight on the crankshaft. Now, apparently, starting around 1970, Ford Parts or Motorcraft came up with a revised piston that would fit both. I'm not 100% sure. Don't quote me on that. It's just something I read. So anyway, these are your 3 different piston and rod combinations in the Windsor series engines. Also worth noting, the 351 was always a 28-ounce imbalance. It didn't change to 50 like the 302 did. It was always 28, from the first one in 1969 to the last one in 1996. And incidentally, the 351 never got rollerized until 1995. So the last year and a bit of production. So you might get lucky in a junkyard and find a 95 or 96 351 with the roller cam in it. But aside from that, they were all flat tappet right to the end, almost. Another worthwhile note, the ugly stepchild of the Windsor engine family, the 255, made from, I think maybe 1979 till about 1981 in Fox body cars, Mustang, Capri, T-Bird. It was a goofy thing. It used the 3-inch stroke of the 302, but with a, I have to look it up here. I have it written down because it's an oddball size. A 3.680 bore. And that was in order for Ford to help with their corporate average fuel economy rating. That was all. It's everything about it is an oddball. Every single part in that engine is an oddball. If you have one that it's in your car and it runs good, that's fine, but there's not really a lot you can do with them, unfortunately. Now we could talk about cylinder heads. There's many different versions of them depending on what year, what engine, what displacement. There's 3 different generations of valve gear we'll get into in a minute. The earliest ones are these 62 221 heads. They've got tiny little chambers, tiny little valves. They've got little wee ports. So you can mix and match. You just need to be aware of what you want the engine to do, what combination of piston and chamber you're using. But that's getting into, building stuff. Basically, the best thing to do with stock engines is just kind of stick with the stuff that it came with. It saves you a lot of mathematics and a lot of headaches down the road. All of the low deck engines like the 302 that these guys came off of use 7/16 head bolts. The tall deck engines, the 351, use 1/2-inch head bolts. And when you get your cylinder head here, it'll say right on it. See there? 351. That denotes that it's got the larger head bolt holes drilled. And this is up until these ones, this is the last generation of kind of real 351 heads, these 76 ones that actually have the large 351 ports. After this, the next generation of 351 heads that came out, they were trying to help with the emissions, and they're basically just 302 heads with bigger holes for the bolt holes. That's how it goes. You can see here, both of these heads have the same size of valves in them. These are 70, I think these are 1975 castings. These heads were used in 75 and 76, and these are the first ones with the small 302 valves. Up till 74, they had, the 351 actually had larger valves. I can't find any of those heads. I've been looking around for a pair, but they're not too easy to find. So that's pretty much it for cylinder heads. When you get up past these ones into the fuel injection era, there are some pretty good heads like the GT40 heads that came on the V8 Explorers. And there was probably some Mustangs that had pretty good heads. But I'm trying to keep this carburetor era and back this video. So, 1986 or 1985 and older. Something also to bear in mind with the cylinder heads, anything older than about 1972, so, the first 10 years of production of these things, you're going to need to have hardened exhaust valve seats installed in the heads, so they'll run on the modern unleaded fuel. Valve seat recession is an issue. My dad had a 68 302 in his F100, and it took a long time because it's not like it was his everyday car, but it took somewhere around 30 or 40,000 miles, and the exhaust valve sunk so far into the head that it literally wouldn't run anymore because the lifters, there was just, they'd collapsed the lifters so far that it was at the point where the valves literally were not closing. And it wouldn't have any compression. It ran like it had a horrible vacuum leak. And we took it apart. And the exhaust valves were way into the heads. Even these later heads from the smog era, the valve seats are induction hardened, and the hardness doesn't go very far into the casting. So if you kind of take away too much when you're doing a valve job, you can actually go right through the hardness and back into just plain old cast iron, and it ends up the same as if you had 1968 heads on there. The valve will start burrowing its way in. So if you have to do too much of a valve job, you actually should put hard seats in these too. Just on the exhaust, the intakes are fine. Also, something I should note is that all of these Ford castings will have a code on them like this, D5 AE, D5 1E. So what's important is the D and the 5. D is the decade, 1970s, and 5 is the year, 75. Same thing with this block. Can we read the code on the block? It's pretty bad, but we deciphered this already. That's also a 75 or 76 casting. These 302 heads, what are these guys? They're so rotten. E5. So this is E, 80s, but 5, 85. So yeah, I remember this is also an E5 block because it's the first roller capable one. You'll also find a number on the crankshaft. Ford was really good at putting numbers on everything. The rods, everything has got a number on it somewhere. Something like this, you might have to bead blast it to find the number, but the number's there. I could see it right there. There is a number on there. So that helps you a lot with these Fords. When you do start mixing and matching parts, there's the number on that. Same thing, you'd have to bead blast that or clean it up to read it. But that really is a big help. Now, on to the valve gear. The original valve train in these things was adjustable. So it used this iron rocker that went on like that, and then a ball and a lock nut. And you adjust it up to 0 lash and then just a tweak, just like you would a Chevy, right? This only lasted from 62 till 64. Starting in 65, they came out with these guys. This is non-adjustable. So you put the rocker goes on. You see on this one, there's a step in the stud. So the rocker goes on. The ball goes on. It's easier when it's on the engine and it has a push rod. And you put the nut down, tighten it, and torque it to spec. Non-adjustable. And this was used from 65 until 1977. Starting in 1978, they abandoned the iron rockers and went with these stamped ones. And they're sitting on a pedestal and they rock on a fulcrum, not a ball. And this went right through till the end of Windsor production. The only other thing that they used was on the Cobra R, the 351. They used aftermarket roller tip rockers. That was only for 2 years in very limited quantities. Now, what is very important is that you don't mix this stuff up. The pedestal mount ones, the 78 up ones, it's pretty hard to put these on it because you don't have a stud. But if you got parts mixed up in here, you'll see the way this thing, it fits over the tip of the valve. Well, you'll notice this. If you use this rocker on this, it's pushing on the retainer, not the valve. The original ones have the little pad, see, that pushes on the actual end of the valve. So you have to be aware of that. You won't find too much of this stuff lying around anymore unless you're dealing with a really, really early engine. So for the most part, what you're going to see is these ones or the stamped ones. Also bear in mind when you're, if you're making an engine out of parts that you've had piled in buckets in your shed for years and years and years, whatever kind of rockers you use, whatever style rockers, you need the rockers that fit your head. Like these rockers belong on the short studs. The other iron rockers belong on the long studs with the positive stops. You also have to make sure you have the right length of push rods for the valve train that you're using. There's at least 3 different lengths of push rods. So you need to make sure you're using the right ones with your rocker setup. There's actually 4 different lengths of push rods if you include the tall deck engines. And I wouldn't doubt, because they increased the deck height 20 thou in 1971, I bet you there's 2 different lengths of push rods for them too. And well, there'll be 3 because there'll be 2 lengths of push rods for the iron rockers because of the deck height change, and there'll be another length for the ones with the stamp, the pedestal mount rockers. See, you have to be up on this stuff. You just have to take your time and make sure you're getting the right parts to put together your engine. As far as camshafts go, most of the factory stuff that you're going to find is broomsticks. So if you want something other than that, you're going to have to go to an aftermarket camshaft. If you're lucky enough to have a roller ready block like that one over there, an 80s one, you could find, there's always lots of Mustang guys in your neighborhood, and you might find a stock Mustang roller cam setup that you could put in there, and it just drops right in that block, and that'll be a great improvement over the flat tappet broomstick that's in it now. Aside from that, there were a couple of decent flat tappet cams offered over the years. The 6970 Mustang 351 4-barrel cam is a little hotter than the 2-barrel one. And there might have been, I'm not sure, like there was 302 4-barrels. I think maybe in 1968, 69 even maybe. I don't know if they had a better cam than the 2-barrel engine or not. And I don't know if in Mustangs, I don't know, the 289 Hypo was the 271 horse 289 with the solid cam and everything. But there may have been a 289 4-barrel. But again, I don't know if that had a better camshaft in it. 99.9% of the camshafts that you're going to find in stock engines are just 2-barrel broomsticks. But what you can do, what we used to do, I've done it with Dodges anyway. I'm sure it would work in a Ford. One way to get a little hotter cam, if you've got a 302, you could grab a cam from a 351. It'll be a little bit better, and you put it in the 302. We used to put 360 and 340 camshafts in 318s, right? Kind of perked them up a bit. It's probably not, if you were to set it up on a dyno and let a computer pick the camshaft, it's not exactly optimum, but it's better than what it had. And the only other thing to remember is if you're messing with the really early ones or the middle ones with the press-in studs, if you start putting camshafts and great big valve springs in them, you have to get these things. You have to pull them out and change it to screw-in studs, or you'll pull the studs out, and that'll ruin your day. Another thing I got to remember is the wacky firing, well, to me, wacky firing order on these Ford engines. I spent my whole life screwing around with Mopars, and they're all the same. 184365772. It's imprinted in my brain. And small block Chevys are the same, right? Well, these Fords, number one, you've got 2. They number the cylinders differently, and they've got different firing orders. So a 302 is 15426378. Fine. A 351, for whatever reason, is 13726548. Now, if you install an aftermarket camshaft in a 302, most of them change it up to the 351 firing order. So that's something to bear in mind if you stick a cam in a, oh, and the 5-liter HO uses the 351 firing order right out of the box. So if you get a roller cam and lifters from the junkyard and stick it in that block over there, you got to remember to change the firing order. Just another one of those little idiosyncrasies. There is a lot to remember with these Ford engines, man. Now we can start working our way out, I guess. Something that needs mentioning is the fuel pump eccentric. On these early ones, you can see here, it's just a one-piece fuel pump eccentric. Nothing too special about that. Later on, in the late 70s, or maybe the early 80s, they came up with these two-piece ones. So it's got an inner and an outer. And these two, this one's seized now from the engine being full of water. But it kind of gives it like a roller effect. Not sure if it works or not. And then you have to watch, if you get too new of an engine, it doesn't have any means of driving a mechanical fuel pump. There's no place to put one on the timing cover. So you have to change some parts internally in order to run a mechanical fuel pump. Most guys just opt for an electric pump at that point. Timing covers and water pumps. Here's an original. This is the one off the 221. And you can see the impeller is proud of the water pump. And it kind of sits down into the timing cover. As far as water pumps on the later engines, you've got two choices. This one here is the cast iron or heavy duty one, which was used on trucks. This one here is the aluminum one used on cars. They fit on the same timing cover. The timing cover is the same no matter what pump you use. The biggest difference is the truck one has got an extra bolt on each side around the water port. You can also get them with the water pump outlet on either side. There's been many incarnations of this stuff over the years. You can see this one, the inlet is on the driver's side. This one is passenger side. It's all good. You just have to make sure that if you're using the serpentine belts, you get the reverse rotation water pump if you need it. I think there's some SERP setups that use a forward rotating pump? Again, that's into the modern stuff that I just don't have a clue about. But you have to be careful with the covers. This is very important. Because you could see, depending on what you're doing with it, there's at least 8 different covers. Some of them, you can see here, it's got a provision for a dipstick. You can see this one does not. Some of them have the provision for the mechanical fuel pump. Both of these do. Some of them do not. And here they are, 6 different ones, right? You can see some of the differences. Without the dipstick hole, with the dipstick hole, with a pump, with electric fuel pump. See, there's nowhere there on that one or this one to put your mechanical fuel pump. So you do have to kind of be aware. I mean, this is not a biggie, right? You just put a Holley blue pump on the frame somewhere and you're good to go. But it can just be a bit of a shock when you don't consider this stuff and you're trying to stick an engine in your car on Sunday afternoon and you're standing there with a fuel pump in your hand and there's nowhere to put it. It happens. And you can see here, this one is for the reverse rotation pump. So you can see here that the 2 ports, they kind of angle a different way. You see how the angle of this one? That one's up, that one's down. Well, this one's down and that one's up. That's the reverse rotation. Serpentine belt. And according to that, I'd say all serpentine belts are reverse rotation. So that's definitely something to be aware of. So here's one of our 221 valve covers beside a later 302 valve covers. They made them a little bit taller for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think the valve gear got a little taller. And number two, when they they went to positive crankcase ventilation. You can see here they had to have room for a baffle and a little bit of a dome inside the valve cover for the PCV to work correctly. So they made the valve covers a little taller. There's probably even taller ones you can get, but most of the ones I've got around here are this height. You'll also notice that these valve covers are blank. There's no holes in them at all. They're literally just covers, because this very early engine, for the first couple of years, the Windsor still used the old draft tube system of ventilation. So you can see the draft tube was hooked to that little cap on the tube is gone, but the draft tube hooked to there on the back of the manifold, and the breather was here on the timing cover, and you put your oil in through the breather cap there. Quite interesting. And then probably by 65, they all had a proper PCV system on them. Here you can see the difference between all the manifolds. Look at this little 221 manifold. Look at the little outlet on it. It's about 1.25 inches. Then we move to a 302 manifold. It's a little more chunky. It's got a little more girth, and it's got a way better size outlet. Then we get up to the 351 manifold. It's got even a bigger plenum, or whatever you want to call that area in there, and an even bigger outlet. So here's another great, like, basically cheap performance, right? If you've got a 302, you could go to the junkyard and grab yourself a pair of 351 manifolds and put them on. That'll get it flowing a lot better. Now, as far as intakes and carburetors go, again, 99% of these things that came out of the factories were just for everyday transportation, and they all had 2-barrel carburetors. There were some 4 barrels. There were a few 4-barrel 302s in 68 Mustangs. There was the 69 and 70, probably 71. I would guess, at least starting in 69, there was the 351 4-barrel available in the Mustang. And then once you got into the 80s, there were 351 4-barrel truck engines, and there was the 302 4-barrel in the Mustang. But that was not till, I don't think, 1984. I mean, even in 1978, if you got a Mustang 2 King Cobra with a 4-speed and everything, it still had a 2-barrel carburetor. This here is a 1985 Mustang GT 4-barrel intake. It's aluminum. It takes a square bore Holley, and it is an EGR manifold. You have to make a gasket and a kind of a plate if you want to use a normal 4-barrel on it to seal up the EGR passages over here on the side. But that's easy enough to do. I use this intake in my stock car. And we had to use stock parts, right? So it was fine. It was better than a 2-barrel. And these intakes are around. You can get these at swap meets and stuff. I think I got this one for $25 because they're not really a great piece. Anybody that's serious about performance will go to an aftermarket one. The other problem with these is they're kind of low because they had to fit this under the hood of a Fox body Mustang, right? They only had so much space to work with. I don't have a factory 4-barrel intake manifold for a 351. So this Edelbrock Performer will have to sub. You can see how much wider it is than a 302 intake manifold. That's just how much further apart the heads are. These are cheap enough. You could find, especially for the 302, you could find old Edelbrock intakes at swap meets and stuff a lot of times for less than $100. You might have to put a couple of Healy coils in it, but you know, that's not too bad. As far as carburetors go, These things came usually with an Autolite 2100. Later, once you got to the late 70s, the kind of the updated version was the 2150. But they mostly all look the same. Now this, look at the tiny little throttle bores on this 221 compared to the 2150 we took off our 302. A lot bigger. So if you could, something like this, it's a good way to perk up. Say you had this 221. Man, you put a set of 302 or 351 exhaust manifolds on it, stick one of these larger carburetors on, you might have to, you know, open up these ports a little bit, but there's lots of meat there to work with. And you could probably get a little more performance out of your engine with junkyard parts. The next step, if you want to keep the 2-barrel, I mean, you just have to measure these, right? They use these carburetors, these 2-barrels, right up onto 429s, you know? So depending on what you've got, if you've got a 302, maybe you could find a 2-barrel off a 390, right? And put that on your 302. There's lots of ways to make them go better with junk from the junkyard. For the ultimate 2-barrel, you go to the Holley 4412. It's a 500 CFM 2-barrel carburetor. It comes with a Ford kickdown linkage and a manual choke. These things are everywhere because it is literally the universal stock car carburetor. All the stock car classes that require a 2-barrel carburetor, this is what they all use. And these things are everywhere. You find them at swap meets. You find them everywhere. I got this one, as a matter of fact, at an auction for $2. I want to try this. We're going to try this on Landshark on the 390, but man, look at that. You could massage the intake manifold a little bit, clean it up, and you could use this thing on a 302 with some, you know, maybe put your 351 exhaust manifolds on it, and I bet you'd have a pretty good running 302 with that thing on there. But say you want to go for a 4-barrel. All right, we can do that. What's around? There's all kinds of stuff. The junkyard and the swap meets are your friend. Most of these things here are Ford factory parts, right? This one here, this is an Autolite 4100. This, I think this is what the first Hypo 289s had on them, was an Autolite 4100. And again, they come in different sizes. The small block one will have less of a CFM rating than one off a 390, right? So you shop around and get the one that you need. I think mostly they all work pretty decent on a small engine like this. And that these are very tunable. They're a great old carburetor. Next thing, if you had like a 68 302 4-barrel or a 69 351 4-barrel, it would come with one of these guys. This is an Autolite 4300. And again, different sizes for different engines. The biggest one of these, if you could find one, was on the 1969 and maybe 70 460 in the Lincoln Mark III. It's the biggest 4300 they ever made. I've got one of those too. We're gonna do a lot of experimenting on Landshark because I'm gonna put a 4-barrel on it after I fiddle around with the 2-barrel, and we're going to see. I've got several of these 4300s to try. Then this here is the ubiquitous 1850 Holley. It's a 600 vacuum secondary. You find these things everywhere at swap meets. The only problem with the 1850, it does not have provision for a Ford kickdown linkage. If your car's a stick shift, you don't care, right? But if you've got an automatic, the kickdown is nice to have, although not required. My dad has got a 302 and a C4 in his 53 F100, and it has never had a kickdown on it. And it, you know, he's never brought it here and said, I gotta have a kickdown on this thing, it's driving me crazy. So it is what it is. This here, this one is a factory. They don't call this They don't call this a Holley carburetor. This is called a Motorcraft 41 model 4180. But for all intent and purpose, it's a factory Holley carburetor that was used on 80s Ford Smogger engines. This is not the one from a 5-liter Mustang. The 5-liter Mustang one, these are both 90 degrees and they come out this side. This one is off a 351 truck or a 460 in a camper or something. Who knows? But, you know, they fit and function mostly the same. You scrounge around, you can find something like this. Look at this thing. This is a Carter AFB, a 625 AFB that we found on an old 391 truck engine in the wreckers. So you could fix this up. Then you can go and you can get an old AFB strip kit or an Edelbrock. Edelbrock makes a version of the AFB and all the internal parts are the same. So you could have like an infinitely tunable AFB on your Ford. This is all crap from the junkyard. And then look at this guy. This guy is it looks like a 390 GT carburetor, but what this is an actual over-the-counter speed shop carburetor that was designed by Holley to replace the 4300 on the 69 and 70 351 high output in a Mustang. So, I mean, you talk about visual impact. Look at that thing. That's a monster. So these are all kind of your factory, well, that's sort of factory. And if you find that at a swap meet, you won't get that for $5. But you've got a lot of options, cheap options for carburation on these things if you want to go with a 4-barrel. Or, like I showed you, you can even monkey around with some 2 barrels. As far as ignition goes, you could stick with the old points distributor like this. There's nothing wrong with them. The biggest problem these days is it's getting harder and harder to find good points. But, you know, you look around, there's some stuff out there. If you go to a name brand auto parts place, I think Napa can still get some decent ignition parts, at least for now. Or you can go to a Duraspark distributor. There's millions of these things around. Just bear in mind that if you're working on a 351, the distributor is in here. It's a little bit longer. It's about an inch longer, I believe, to make up for the additional deck height. Although from here up, it's the same. So that'll do it for this one. I've just literally just scratched the surface of these Ford small block engines. They're, you know, you could write a book this thick about them and still miss stuff. There's just so much to them. When something is in production for 40 years, there's going to be some changes. What's important to understand with these things is when you start mixing and matching parts, you've got to mix and match them correctly or you're going to run into problems, you know. So please, there's piles of you guys out there, I'm sure, that know way more about these engines than I do. I just wanted to kind of lay out some junkyard spotter stuff and kind of give a few ideas of what you could do to improve things using junkyard parts, right? If I've missed anything or botched anything up, please message me directly or put something in the comments below. I don't want to be a purveyor of bad information. That doesn't help anybody. Anyway, I'm going to take off now. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you'll come back and see us again on the Claremont Classic Garage. And until then, I'm Kevin saying so long for now.